Good evening. My name is Andrea Palmer, and I am the Grants Manager for the City of Oxnard's Housing Department. I'm here this evening to present to you the 2022-23 Annual Action Plan, in addition to the 2021 and 2020 Annual Action Plan amendments. To quickly recap, the city receives three entitlement funding allocations from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or more commonly known as HUD. They are the Community Development Block Grant, otherwise known as Cdbg funds, the Home Investment Partnership Program, otherwise known as Home Funds, and the Emergency Shelter Grant, otherwise known as ESG funds. In more recent years, we have received special grants in support of addressing needs through the COVID pandemic. In 2020, HUD provided the CARES Act funds for this purpose. In order to use these funds, activities must exhibit preventing, preparing, or responding to the impacts related to COVID. In order to receive any of these funds, an action and funding plan must be submitted to HUD for review and consideration. When programs or funds need to be adjusted, action plans need to be amended. Hence, part of the reason why we are here this evening. Let's start with the 2022 Annual Action Plan. The city, like all other cities, have not received notice from HUD of the 2022-2023 entitlement allocations at this time. Therefore, the estimates provided this evening are based upon last year's awards. Staff estimates receiving $3.7 million between the three programs. Specifically, funding recommendations are based upon the following projections: $2.5 million in Cdbg funds, $764,000 in home funds, and $219,000 in ESG funds. Let's review the funding recommendations in further detail. The city received a total of 24 applications for the 2022-2023 program year. Of them, 11 public service applications were submitted, and 9 public improvement and other project applications were submitted, all for Cdbg. The remaining 4 applications were submitted for ESG funding. Let's start with Cdbg. Beginning with the administration line item, it's anticipated that the city's administrative line item will be $523,000, which is 20% of the city's projected award, plus 20% of the program income estimated to be received within that fiscal year. The city is only allowed to use up to 20% of the administrative costs of the entire entitlement award, as stated earlier. And any program income, which is typically funding received through repayment of loan programs, that money can be returned to the program and used to use for other programs, and a small portion of it can be used for administration as well. But it cannot exceed 20% of the program income. Administration will include some fair housing activities that we will discuss further in the public services section of the presentation. But here is a list of the proposed and recommended activities. As you will see, all 11 are listed. There are 2 activities that were not recommended for funding. The first is Easter Seals Diagnostic Clinic, where the program is very valuable to the community. However, it did not fit many of the priorities established within the Cdbg parameters when compared against other applications. The other activity to note is fair housing, which is not recommended for public service funds. However, there will be funds appropriated for this service through either the administrative line item for Cdbg or general funds, as fair housing is a program that is required in order to receive entitlement funding. With all considerations provided, the public service recommendations total $392,000, right up to the 15% public services cap. The next category is public improvements and other programs. All other programs were considered for funding. After the submission of the applications um, for this category, Public Works reached out to Housing to state that they received other funding sources for two of the three projects they initially submitted for. They requested that any funds that were considered for the two projects now being funded by another source be considered for the one remaining project still in the application queue without a funding source. The remaining project, the court reconstruction and resurfacing project, was recommended by staff at $954,000. The total public improvement and other programs total, the request was $3.3 million, and staff has it recommended at $1.7 million. To recap, there are three general categories where the requests totaled $4.4 million, and staff recommended funding each area at with a cumulative total of $2.6 million, which is up to the amount estimated to be received within that fiscal year. Just to note, it may be recognized that some applications were regular annual submissions were not submitted this year. For example, code enforcement was notably left off the list. Cdbg funds received through HUD are limited. Through evaluation and some discussion, city leadership was able to determine that some internal projects typically funded through these programs could be funded at the same level through general funds. This allows for the project to have no additional restrictions from the federal government, and also allows an increased availability of funds for local nonprofits to execute more services. Moving on to ESG. ESG funds begin with a modest administration of $16,000. ESG has a funding cap of 7.5%, therefore cannot exceed that percentage of what the city anticipates receiving from HUD. There's also a 60% cap on funding activities for emergency services and street outreach collectively. All four organizations that applied for ESG funds were considered for funding through what the city projects to receive. The only substantial consideration was for Mercy House, which was the rapid rehousing program, as the services provided through this program expressed the need for increased funds due to a high demand in services. At this time, staff, when it comes to the home funds, staff is providing to council that home funds will likely be awarded in the new fiscal year and estimates receiving $864,000. It's actually $764,000 with $100,000 in program income to make the $864,000. As for the substantial amendments, we'll start with the 2021 annual action plan. The first amendment to that prior year set of funds is to award the Salvation Army with $101,000, moving it from the Homeless Services Division of Street Outreach to a street outreach activity executed by the Salvation Army. The next amendment is the 2020 annual action plan, where there are two projects that are moving from the Homeless Services Division. The first is rapid rehousing services that is proposed to be executed by Mercy House. That's at $71,000. And then the second is moving from street outreach to an emergency shelter activity in the amount of $52,000, proposed to be executed by Turning Point. Staff requests that City Council conduct the following: a public hearing to receive comments regarding the 2020 and 2021 annual action plan amendments and the 2022-2023 annual action plan draft document with funding recommendations for the third year of the Ventura County Regional Consolidated Plan. It is requested that council approve the 2022 annual action plan with recommended use of funds for the selected activities that conform to the consolidated plan goals as defined in the regional consolidated plan for the 3 entitlement grants, and for this plan to be submitted to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as prescribed. Number 3 is to approve the updated changes in the activities pertinent to the 2021 Action Plan Amendment and the 2020 Action Plan Amendment, specifically related to ESG. It is requested that council authorize the city manager and his designees to incorporate the annual the actual HUD grant allocation in the 2022 action plan that includes increasing or decreasing approved activities by 10%, approved recommendation based upon the actual HUD grant allocation, authorize the city manager and his designee to incorporate any recommended changes resulting from the public input to the 2022 annual action plan, the 2021 annual action plan amendment, or the 2020 annual action plan amendment as directed by city council, including amending any budget appropriations approved by the city council. It is also requested that council authorize the city manager and his designees to execute the required applications, certifications, and other pertinent documents for the submission of the 2022 annual action plan and any documents for the 2021 annual action plan amendment and 2020 annual action plan amendment to HUD, and authorize the city manager and his designees to execute HUD agreements and sign all agreements for the implementation of the annual action plan, including subrecipient, interdepartmental, and intradepartmental agreements. This concludes our presentation. Any questions and comments are welcomed.